Good. Well, thanks. I should just say thanks to the attendees for the chat that's been going on, both in the kind of Q&A stream, but also the chat generally. And one of the bigger issues that's come up is around, I suppose, modern breeding techniques, regulation, gene editing, and so forth. And so perhaps we could just get Jerry and Ian involved at this point. And Jerry, you've seen some of the discussions there, but perhaps it might be helpful just to start for the people who are less aware of what the I suppose policy context and the science opportunity is. If you could just start by saying a little bit about the position currently on new breeding techniques.
Okay, so I suppose in many respects this all stems from a decision that the European Court of Justice took on new breeding techniques a number of years ago now, in which they decided that new breeding techniques, and by that I'm probably specifically meaning sort of gene editing, was a form of genetic modification. And so therefore really within Scotland really there's a moratorium on the production really of genetically modified crops. So moving on to this year, the UK government, when we left the European Union, had held a consultation specifically looking to remove new breeding techniques from the definition of genetic modification. So that has a little bit of time to go really before they make a public announcement on which way they're going to go. But in the intervening period at the end of April, there was a study paper that was produced by the European Commission, which also identified the fact that that it was problematic from an enforcement point of view to actually consider something that's gene edited as a form of genetic modification. So, you know, it's difficult to say for certain, but it does feel like the wind of change is blowing to sort of remove new breeding techniques or certain new breeding techniques from the definition of genetic modification. So the Scottish Government also has been quite clear really since we've left the European Union that its preferred position would be to align as far as possible really with European legislation really. And you know, I think it's probably fair to say that it doesn't automatically follow that if the EU was to change a policy that the Scottish Government would always follow suit. But I do feel that sort of, you know, if in England really sort of new breeding techniques were to be removed from the definition of genetic modification, and maybe it's going to take a little bit longer, but the European Union was to sort of go down a similar route, it's difficult to see the Scottish Government sort of, you know, remaining sort of, you know, foursquare against that position. So I do feel that things are changing. Also, you know, to maybe just pick up one of the points that Keith Dawson made about the role that the Scottish Plant Health Centre can play in all this. I think, you know, I would use the example that Fiona gave really of the pesticides is exactly the sort of role that the Plant Health Centre can play in this position, because the Plant Health Centre really was instrumental in bringing all that information together on the impact of pesticide sort of withdrawals really, and you know that ultimately led to a meeting with stakeholders, which was attended by the then Cabinet Secretary. So in some respects, I think that might be the model for the way that we go forward, really. So, and the government's always interested in hearing evidence and views really from other people. So I think that, yes, the Plant Health Centre has a role to play in this, absolutely.
Thanks for that. And I don't know whether Ian or Fiona would like to come in on that, because yes, the question was very much what's the position government-wise, and shouldn't we be grasping these new technologies in the light of what it's done in the COVID world and in the light of the potential of leaving the EU. But the sort of second strand was, shouldn't the Plant Health Centre be taking more of an advocacy role? I guess you're proposing a sort of middle route of at least evidence gatherer, but Ian or Fiona, do you want to touch on that?
I would share what you've just said about it being evidence-based is kind of where we're at, leading to then, you know, the balanced use of advice. I think clearly the potential for, you know, other ways of producing varietal resistance gives us another tool and is really sensible. My health warning there, though, you know, history has taught us that where we're over-reliant on any one simple tool, we abuse it and break it. And I think what we have learned, again, from the pesticide example, is where we develop very simple production systems heavily reliant on a few tools, they're vulnerable. So I would just give that balance at the moment.
I was going to say, I didn't take my microphone off. I forgot to press the button. So I was going to say, I mean, Jerry gave a very good update on the current situation, and modern breeding technologies, without doubt, have potential. And this is, as Jerry said, this is more of a political issue at the moment. But as we lose pesticides, we do have to find replacements for those pesticides. And so far, there aren't enough options for replacement. So we're going to have to make decisions in the not too distant future what kind of control, pest and disease controls we have. So I think we need to keep working with government. I think the job of the Plant Health Centre is about providing data that Jerry and colleagues can then go on to use with government rather than us lobbying directly for it. And as we've said in several areas today, I think that's what we're doing quite effectively. And I just think we should keep going, doing that kind of thing, and hopefully something will happen in terms of how biotechnology and new breeding technologies might be used in the future.
Thanks very much. And just picking up one of the questions that I put to the team for the last talk, which was this sort of role of regulation. And I guess it's often seen as a relatively easy solution that surely we can just regulate against something. Jerry, I think it probably is more of a sort of policy question. The specifics was around the risk of moving high-risk host plants. Can you give us a sort of insight about the process for that and how easy it is to achieve?
Sorry, do you want to expand on that one a little bit, Chris? Really?
I think the let me just find
all right, okay.
It's the question was, what does the panel think about the role of regulation? Voluntary schemes and raising awareness is important, but should the movement of high-risk hosts be more strongly regulated? So I think it was partly reflecting on the mention of plant healthy and equivalent, but is there a role for regulation on top of that?
Well, I think undoubtedly, yes, there is. And I suppose I would point to the tightening up of the measures specifically to protect us against Xylella that have been introduced really in GB really at the beginning of this year, where certain high-risk hosts such as lavender, olives, to name just two really, sort of, you know, that is much more restrictive to bring that sort of planting material into the country now than it was previously. So, you know, to be honest, it may well be one of the advantages that we have being outside the European Union, that we can be fleeter of foot, really, sort of, you know, in terms of adding to that list of high-risk plants into the future to ensure that we protect our own farmed and natural environment going forward. Actually, if I could maybe just expand out my answer a little bit further, that one of the other points really about procurement was an area that we have been sort of working with colleagues in Scottish Government specifically on that issue, and it is hard work, really hard work to get them to accept sort of biosecurity as one of the sort of the key factors really in decisions to procure, but we have made a little bit of progress really in terms of the Scottish Government procurement strategy, which I think runs up until March of 2023 now, in which sort of protection of the environment really is something which has a little bit more profile than it had previously, and does specifically say protecting sort of animal and plant life. So we have a foot in the door there, but we have to work much harder really on that to sort of ensure that particularly some of the big capital projects, such as things like dualling of the A9, really, that the procurement really of that planting stock, actually, there's a strong focus really on biosecurity, really, as part of a major project such as that.
Great, thanks very much. I think I might just change tack slightly, because there was a number of questions and comments around the fellowship that we mentioned with Nature Scott, and who it was and what it was intended to do. Pete, are you the best person to start the answer on that one?
Yeah, I'm delighted to. So Ruth Mitchell from the James Hutton Institute is undertaking the fellowship, and she's working very, very closely, particularly with Duncan Stone in Nature Scott. So Ruth, I think, has put her contact details through in the chat window, and over the coming months we'll be developing a work plan, and some of the key issues that might be looked at would be plant health threats to upland heath systems, and really a general horizon scan about where are the greatest knowledge gaps for the natural environment. And it really is an area where the range of potential targets to be affected and the range of potential threats to those targets is extremely high, and thinking about how one can sensibly prioritize plugging those knowledge gaps and triggering positive actions. So Ruth is the Plant Health Fellow for the Natural Environment, working with Nature Scott.
Great, thanks very much. And Ian, I don't know whether you want to say anything about the role such fellowships might have in pursuing, the Plant Health Centre agenda going forward.
Yeah, I think rather than everything happening within the centre, it gives us the opportunity to actually have people within different sectors and different areas of plant health and spending a little bit more time with them. So I think we're all hugely excited about the role that Ruth's going to play with Nature Scott, and this is really a pilot to see how it works. And if it's successful, then we can think about doing other ones. But we're really excited to look at how it works, see what comes out of it, see how we can link to various people within the natural environment, and then look to expanding it in the future.
That's great. So I think please do get in touch with Ruth Mitchell if you're a particular interest in the biosecurity of the natural environment. Do get in touch, I think, with any of the centre members with ideas for future research. You've heard a lot about our existing portfolio, but we're beginning to think forwards as to what should we be studying next. I think you've given us already in the queue, in the chat and the Q&A, some ideas. One of the other areas that we're interested in exploring is potentially the biosecurity risks of composting, and particularly with the push towards peat alternatives, replacement of peat for very valid reasons. Are there lurking biosecurity risks to be had from alternative composting things? So that's just one example of a number of areas. But I'm going to hand back to Pete, I think, to wrap up. We're running out of time.
Perfect. Thanks, Chris. And just really to finish the event with a very big thank you to all the speakers for such wonderful presentations, and a big thank you to Gemma Noble and Kirstine Lamb, who've been behind the Zoom scenes running the webinar, and we're really grateful to them for making it happen. And also thank you to Damien Bienkowski and Sonia Humphreys for conference organisation. So I'm hoping that in the chat window you either can see or you will be about to see a link to the poster session. Please follow that to peruse the posters that contain additional information. One of the posters has got a link to a plant health survey, and that's an additional mechanism for you to record your views, plant health concerns, or other key points you'd like to raise with the team at the Plant Health Centre. And with that, we'll bring the event to a close with a final thanks to the audience for the participation, really stimulating comments and questions, and many thanks for joining the event. Great you joined us, and enjoy the posters.